if you want to pull off a completely flawless stealth abduction. But while this incredibly clumsy performance was being securely recorded on the front porch, he is heavily dressed in dark tactical clothing, wearing thick protective gloves, and carrying a large backpack. His face is entirely hidden behind a restrictive physical mask, but it is not his tactical appearance that deeply shocked the behavioral profiling experts. It is his incredibly strange and highly contradictory physical behavior. The masked man does not aggressively kick down the heavy front door. He does not attempt to skillfully pick the complex mechanical lock. Instead, he slowly reaches his gloved hands toward the glowing lens of the security camera, holding a large handful of completely natural desert debris. He clumsily uses broken twigs, dry leaves, and small branches that he seemingly gathered from the immediate surrounding landscaping to manually block the visual field of the recording device. He presses the dead vegetation directly against the camera housing until the digital feed goes completely dark. The screen officially fades to black. And this specific, terrifying moment initiates a heavily confirmed timeline gap that lasts for exactly 15 minutes. An 84-year-old woman was being completely erased from existence inside the walls of her own home. During this incredibly brief 15-minute window of total digital blindness, Nancy Guthrie is entirely removed from the physical premises. When we critically analyze this specific sequence of events from a strictly psychological perspective, we immediately hit a massive, glaring behavioral disconnect. A criminal profile is supposed to remain logically consistent. You simply cannot be two completely different types of offenders at the exact same time. On one hand, the physical extraction of the victim was a masterpiece of dark operational efficiency. It was silent, completely trace-free, and executed within a profoundly restrictive 15-minute time frame. That specific outcome requires a highly organized, deeply experienced, and incredibly professional criminal mind. But on the other hand, the individual captured on the front porch behaves exactly like a clumsy, unorganized amateur, a professional operative attempting a rapid, stealthy abduction does not waste highly valuable seconds foraging for dry leaves in the dark. A true professional would utilize a powerful laser to instantly blind the optical sensor. She simply vanished into thin air in a confirmed window of exactly 15 minutes. Or use a quick burst of opaque spray paint, or simply sever the data cable to instantly kill the entire localized network. The act of using loose leaves to obscure a lens is highly inefficient, deeply unreliable, and incredibly time-consuming. So, the most important psychological question of this entire investigation is born right here on this front porch. Why would a highly capable, stealthy kidnapping crew suddenly employ such a hilariously primitive and deeply flawed method of digital sabotage? Was the suspected porch guy simply an incompetent hired hand who severely panicked and made a foolish mistake under intense pressure? Or was this incredibly clumsy performance actually a highly calculated, intentional act of psychological manipulation? Please make sure to hit the notification bell right now, because as we move deeper into the physical evidence, we are going to completely dissect the dark psychology behind this bizarre behavioral contradiction. The federal behavioral analysts studying this footage refused to believe that a team capable of perfectly erasing a human being would leave their digital security protocol to completely random chance. Not a single piece of heavy wooden furniture was overturned in the living room. The profound clumsiness on the videotape felt entirely staged. It felt like a cheap theatrical trick designed specifically to command the absolute attention of the viewer. When the Federal Bureau of Investigation officially assumes control of a highly sensitive and deeply complex missing persons case, their elite profiling units immediately begin to completely deconstruct the specific modus operandi, or the method of operation, utilized by the suspected offenders. The fundamental theory of criminal behavioral analysis strictly dictates that absolutely every single physical action taken by a perpetrator at a live crime scene serves a very specific psychological or deeply practical purpose. Nothing is ever truly accidental when the ultimate stakes involve federal kidnapping charges. Therefore, the investigative team had to thoroughly analyze the profound strangeness of the suspected porch guy and his bizarre handful of dry leaves. By choosing to manually hold natural debris over the camera lens instead of instantly destroying the fragile electronic device, the masked intruder was actively making a highly critical psychological decision. Not a single desperate cry for help was heard by anyone. He was intentionally choosing to significantly prolong his physical presence in front of the recording lens. Destroying the camera with a heavy tool would have taken a fraction of a single second and allowed him to immediately proceed with the violent home invasion. But standing there, carefully arranging the dry twigs and shifting the dead leaves to ensure total visual coverage cost him highly valuable operational time. In the intensely stressful, high-stakes environment of a targeted abduction, time is the single most precious and rapidly depleting resource a criminal possesses. Voluntarily wasting that incredibly precious time strongly indicates that the act of being clearly seen and deeply analyzed by the security camera was actually more important to the overall mission than quickly breaching the front door. The masked suspect was quite literally ensuring that his tactical clothing, his thick gloves, and his specific physical dimensions were permanently recorded into the federal evidence database. While the behavioral unit was deeply wrestling with the psychological implications of this strange video, the physical evidence response team meticulously sweeping the isolated desert property secured a massive, potentially case-altering breakthrough. According to heavily verified reports released by the Associated Press, the profound and heavy silence of the physical crime scene heavily contradicts the chaotic clumsiness captured on the digital video. Specialized forensic laboratory technicians successfully identified and isolated traces of completely foreign biological DNA left behind at the immediate crime scene. This microscopic genetic material did not belong to Nancy Guthrie, nor did it match the known genetic profiles of any of her immediate family members or her cleared personal associates. The sudden discovery of external DNA is traditionally considered the ultimate holy grail in any complex criminal investigation. It is the solid, undeniable biological anchor that can definitively tie a completely unknown suspect directly to the physical environment of the crime. However, When you are actively investigating a criminal enterprise that has already clearly demonstrated a highly sophisticated ability to actively manipulate physical evidence and intentionally stage video recordings, the sudden appearance of a pristine biological sample must be treated with extreme psychological caution. Criminal psychologists deeply understand a highly deceptive tactic known as planting a red herring. A red herring is a piece of highly compelling, entirely false physical evidence, intentionally left behind at a crime scene specifically designed to completely derail the entire law enforcement investigation. If you genuinely want to physically remove a human being from a highly secure location without making a single sound, if the suspected porch guy was intentionally performing for the digital camera, is it not entirely possible that he also intentionally left behind a completely unrelated biological sample to further confuse the federal laboratories? Imagine a terrifying scenario where the perpetrators deliberately obtained a random piece of discarded biological material from a public location miles away and then purposely dropped that specific material near the isolated property during the abduction. The massive federal investigative machine would immediately dedicate countless hours and massive amounts of financial resources to tracking down the owner of that specific DNA profile, while the actual perpetrators quietly slipped away in the completely opposite direction. This specific psychological possibility creates a deeply agonizing situation for the federal agents actively working the case. They absolutely must pursue the biological evidence with their full operational capacity, because it might be the single fatal mistake made by a highly arrogant criminal, but they must simultaneously maintain the terrifying awareness that the genetic sequence currently processing in their advanced laboratories might simply be another carefully constructed layer of the elaborate psychological trap. You absolutely do not waste valuable time gathering, landscaping debris in the front yard. They are forced to aggressively chase a microscopic ghost that the real attackers may have intentionally created just to keep them permanently occupied. The profound tension between trusting the hard physical science of biological identification and deeply doubting the psychological intent behind its sudden discovery creates an incredibly complex puzzle that the authorities are still desperately trying to completely unravel. As the Federal Behavioral Unit desperately attempted to decode the psychological meaning behind the intentionally discarded genetic material, the entire scope of the investigation was suddenly and violently derailed by a massive influx of malicious external communications whenever a highly publicized disappearance captures the national attention. It invariably attracts a deeply disturbing element of opportunistic predators who seek to financially exploit the profound vulnerability of the grieving family. According to confirmed reports from the Associated Press and Fox News, a highly coordinated wave of alarming digital ransom, notes, and complex extortion emails suddenly began flooding into prominent media outlets and official law enforcement portals. These disturbing messages were not simply vague threats hastily typed by amateur internet trolls. Unless, of course, The dry leaves were never actually meant to hide the alleged attacker. They contained incredibly specific and tightly guarded physical details regarding the immediate environment of the abducted woman. The anonymous senders explicitly referenced highly obscure information, such as a noticeably malfunctioning exterior lighting fixture on the property and the specific brand of an Apple Watch she purportedly owned. For a brief and terrifying moment, the profiling unit believed they were finally establishing a direct psychological dialogue with the actual perpetrators. Establishing communication is often considered a critical turning point in any abduction crisis because it provides behavioral analysts with a wealth of linguistic data to deeply analyze. They can study the specific word choices, the level of emotional volatility, and the underlying psychological motivation of the demands. But the cold reality of the modern digital landscape is often far more parasitic and deeply frustrating than a straightforward ransom negotiation. The federal authorities were quickly forced to issue a severe public warning regarding a rapidly growing underground network of digital imposters. These highly manipulative individuals meticulously scan the daily news cycle for high-profile tragedies and systematically, unless the entire clumsy performance was a highly intentional, meticulously crafted psychological script designed specifically to make federal investigators look exactly in the wrong direction, manufacture highly credible fake communications to successfully extort massive sums of money from desperate relatives, law enforcement officially confirmed that multiple arrests had already been executed involving individuals who were entirely disconnected from the actual Arizona incident, but were simply attempting to illegally monetize the horrific situation. This deliberate injection of completely fabricated intelligence created a catastrophic operational nightmare for the investigators. The behavioral analysts were now completely buried under a mountain of artificially generated psychological noise. Every single incoming message had to be treated as a potentially lethal lead until it could be definitively disproven through exhaustive digital tracing. The massive amount of critical resources that should have been dedicated to profiling the actual physical attackers was heavily diverted into chasing down digital phantoms generated by malicious actors thousands of miles away. But while the cyber division was completely bogged down in this artificial chaos, the analysts back at the original crime scene began to realize they were looking entirely in the wrong direction. Why would you ever choose to play the role of a bumbling petty thief on the front porch? The behavioral answer to this terrifying physical disconnect will chill you to the bone. The psychological answer they were desperately seeking was absolutely not hidden in the fraudulent extortion emails. And it certainly was not standing on the front steps holding a handful of vegetation. The true behavioral profile of this terrifying operation was actually waiting for them in a completely different area of the property that everyone had seemingly ignored. The alleged attackers were incredibly well versed in how federal agencies operate and how the media consumes information. They knew that dropping a few highly specific details into the digital ether would completely consume the narrative for days or even weeks. Do you personally believe the biological evidence discovered earlier was a completely unintentional mistake or a deliberately planted distraction to further fuel this chaotic noise? Please leave your detailed behavioral analysis in the comments section below so we can discuss the psychology of evidence manipulation. As the investigators slowly began to cut through the massive web of digital deception, they decided to completely reset their entire analytical framework. They needed to completely strip away all the external distractions and return to the absolute physical basics of the structural environment. If the front entrance was nothing more than an elaborate psychological stage play and the ransom, at Ellis Case Reports, we do not just simply read the cold police files. We actively decode the darkest corners of the criminal mind. Emails were completely fabricated, static. Then how did the actual physical extraction truly occur? The behavioral unit fundamentally understood that a perfectly silent operation required a perfectly unhindered path of least resistance. The perpetrators would never risk dragging a captive through a highly visible or mechanically complicated exit point. They needed a smooth, silent, and completely prearranged doorway to the outside world. This logical deduction forced the agents to finally shift their intense focus away from the chaotic front of the house and carefully examine the completely dark and silent rear perimeter. The dark rear of the large house offered complete invisibility from the street. It was the absolute perfect blind spot for a predator to operate without any fear of immediate detection. They needed to analyze this untouched space with fresh eyes and a deeply renewed sense of terrifying psychological clarity. During a highly emotional and incredibly revealing national television interview, broadcast exclusively on the NBC Today show, Savannah Guthrie officially, if you want deep behavioral analysis backed strictly by verified investigative facts, you need to subscribe right now. Confirmed a completely devastating piece of physical evidence that instantly shattered every previous assumption about the actual abduction timeline. She explicitly stated that the heavy rear door of her mother's isolated home was discovered in a highly specific structural state. The rear entrance had been intentionally and strategically propped open prior to the horrific event. This single, seemingly innocuous architectural detail is the absolute psychological key that finally unlocks the terrifying reality of the 15-minute operational window. According to the sharp behavioral analysis provided by experienced legal commentators on the Fox News network, this specific physical anomaly heavily suggests the definitive presence of a second, entirely unseen perpetrator currently categorized by analysts as the phantom. The entire psychological profile of the crime violently shifts from a single, deeply incompetent burglar to a highly synchronized and heavily rehearsed two-person tactical extraction unit. We can finally comprehend the absolute brilliance of the psychological misdirection. The heavily disguised man standing in the bright infrared light of the front porch was never actually intending to forcefully breach the main entrance. Let us begin to properly profile the suspected intruder and systematically uncover the dark psychology of that night. He represents what behavioral profilers classify as the distraction profile. His sole operational directive was to actively trigger the automated security sensors, create a highly visible digital disturbance, and completely consume the artificial attention of the electronic surveillance system. By awkwardly holding those dead branches against the camera lens. He intentionally forced the security software and eventually the human investigators to intensely focus all of their analytical energy on the front steps. He was performing an elaborate, incredibly loud psychological magic trick, and exactly like any masterful illusionist, the true sleight of hand was happening entirely in the dark, far away from the captivated audience. While the security network was completely blinded and desperately trying to process the bizarre behavior of the decoy on the porch, the actual extraction profile was quietly executing the primary objective at the completely unmonitored rear of the property. The Phantom utilized the pre-arranged, heavily compromised back door to slip silently into the quiet interior of the house. Nancy Guthrie possessed a daily routine that was practically carved into solid stone, because the structural pathway had already been meticulously prepared and secretly propped open in advance. This secondary operative did not have to waste a single precious second violently breaking glass or aggressively destroying heavy deadbolts. They simply glided into the dark residence like an absolute ghost. This perfectly explains the profound lack of any violent physical struggle or shattered furniture within the primary living spaces. The Phantom possessed the exact element of total, uncompromising surprise. They were able to completely subdue the elderly victim and smoothly extract her through the silent rear exit, while the entire world was unknowingly staring at the clumsy fool performing on the front porch. The pure psychological terror of this specific revelation is absolutely paralyzing. It proves beyond any reasonable doubt that the victim was entirely surrounded and structurally trapped before the criminal operation even officially commenced. The attackers possessed a terrifyingly deep understanding of modern security vulnerabilities and human cognitive biases. At 84 years old, she lived entirely alone in the exclusive and highly secured residential enclave of the Catalina foothills in Tucson, Arizona. They actively knew that law enforcement heavily relies on digital video evidence. So they intentionally manufactured a highly compelling piece of fake video evidence to completely control the subsequent forensic narrative. They weaponized the natural human instinct to look directly at the loudest and most obvious threat. The sheer level of strict operational discipline required to successfully execute a simultaneous, dual-pronged psychological breach against a highly secure target elevates this specific incident into the absolute upper echelon of organized criminal behavior. The front porch actor and the silent phantom worked in absolute perfect psychological harmony to completely erase a human life. Please hit the like button right now if the cold, calculating brilliance of this elaborate psychological misdirection truly made your blood run cold. The profound realization that the entire front door sequence was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated theatrical performance completely forces the investigating agents to question absolutely every single piece of physical data they have collected so far. It fundamentally alters the entire trajectory of the federal manhunt. This is a quiet, sun-baked community where sprawling properties are heavily shielded by dense desert landscaping and tall private gates. They are no longer actively searching for a solitary, deeply foolish criminal who made a massive mistake with a handful of leaves. They are now hunting a highly sophisticated tactical element that understands exactly how to perfectly manipulate the human mind and completely exploit the blind spots of modern technology. The incredibly dark reality of the phantom slipping quietly through the open back door while the digital alarms blared at the front gate is the exact terrifying image that keeps the veteran behavioral analysts awake late into the night. The sheer complexity of this carefully staged psychological operation has left the Federal Behavioral Analysis Unit staring at a deeply unfinished criminal profile. The massive federal investigation is currently forced into a grueling and highly frustrating state of prolonged stagnation. The initial physical crime scene was completely scrubbed of any genuine behavioral clues because the perpetrators intentionally flooded the environment with highly engineered psychological misdirection. Every single time the investigating agents believe they have secured a solid analytical foothold, the underlying reality of the elaborately staged narrative completely shifts beneath their feet. For most local residents, this profound geographic isolation provides a deep sense of absolute peace and security. This profound uncertainty creates a massive open wound for the grieving family who remain entirely trapped in the deafening silence left behind by the perfectly executed extraction. The heavy doors of the Catalina Foothills property are now securely locked and tightly sealed with official police tape. But the psychological damage inflicted upon that quiet desert community is entirely irreversible. The central and most agonizing question that continues to completely dominate the daily briefings at the federal field office revolves entirely around the microscopic biological evidence currently being heavily processed in the advanced government laboratories. When the highly complex genetic sequencing is finally completed by the forensic scientists whose definitive behavioral profile will that specific sequence actually match? Will the isolated biological markers officially belong to the deeply theatrical decoy who clumsily performed his assigned role in front of the digital camera on the front porch? Or will the microscopic evidence completely shock the investigative team by finally revealing the true biological identity of the... But Nancy was not just an ordinary, wealthy retiree quietly living out her twilight years in the dry desert air. Completely silent phantom who flawlessly executed the terrifying abduction through the intentionally propped open rear entrance. There is also the deeply terrifying third psychological possibility that heavily burdens the minds of the veteran criminal profilers. What if the completely foreign biological material belongs to neither of the two alleged attackers? What if the highly sophisticated extraction team intentionally dropped a completely unrelated biological sample at the physical crime scene just to ensure the authorities would waste countless months chasing a completely innocent ghost? The agonizing lack of any definitive resolution leaves the psychological portrait of the attackers completely fractured and deeply terrifying. The brilliant misdirection successfully executed on that quiet Sunday morning definitively proves that the elusive perpetrators possess an incredibly advanced understanding of human cognitive psychology and complex operational staging. They successfully proved that they can completely manipulate a highly secure physical environment and entirely control the resulting law enforcement narrative from the shadows. The most deeply unsettling psychological reality of this entire unresolved investigation is that the incredibly intelligent mind responsible, she was the mother of Savannah Guthrie, a prominent television personality and one of the most recognizable faces in American broadcast media today. For designing this flawless tactical misdirection is still actively operating somewhere out in the completely unmonitored world. The heavy rear door of the Arizona residence has been permanently closed by the federal authorities, but the incredibly dark and deeply calculating phantom is still quietly breathing in the shadows. They are likely still meticulously studying the predictable daily routines of other highly valuable proxy targets living alone in deeply isolated communities. They are actively watching from the dark perimeter, patiently waiting to carefully design their next flawless psychological stage play. The profound silence of the unsolved case serves as a constant and deeply terrifying reminder that the most dangerous human predators do not just forcefully break through our physical walls. They intentionally hack directly into our basic human perception and completely hijack our natural attention. We are left completely staring into a dark and empty void, desperately waiting for the cold scientific reality of the genetic sequencing to finally answer the massive psychological questions that the staged crime scene intentionally left behind. A man stands directly in the glowing infrared light of a high-definition security camera. This extremely high-profile biological connection completely altered the fundamental reality of her daily existence. Until that microscopic evidence is officially identified, the dark phantom of the Catalina foothills remains entirely invisible and completely undefeated. The veteran behavioral profilers working this deeply disturbing case are currently experiencing an unprecedented level of intense professional exhaustion. They have been brutally outmaneuvered by an extremely patient psychological entity that actively anticipated absolutely every single standard law enforcement response protocol. This profound realization entirely forces the behavioral analysis unit to completely rewrite their internal training manuals regarding advanced residential threats. They must actively adapt to a deeply terrifying new reality where physical evidence is heavily weaponized to manipulate them. The profound psychological concept of criminal staging and elaborate misdirection is absolutely critical to deeply understanding this terrifying investigation. When a highly suspicious behavioral anomaly occurs at a live crime scene, such as an intruder seemingly wasting incredibly valuable time, manually obscuring a camera lens with natural debris instead of instantly destroying it, behavioral profilers immediately recognize a highly dangerous psychological smokescreen. This specific type of highly theatrical criminal behavior is intentionally designed to act as a massive cognitive sinkhole. It forcefully draws the absolute full attention of the electronic security system and the subsequent. In the deeply clinical world of criminal behavior analysis, an elderly individual living alone in an isolated geographic location, human investigators directly toward a highly visible, completely manufactured focal point. The ultimate behavioral goal is to ensure that a far more precise and devastating tactical strike can be executed entirely unseen in a completely different physical location. What this specific case deeply teaches us about the modern evolution of criminal staging is incredibly alarming from a pure behavioral analysis perspective. It strictly demonstrates that highly advanced modern criminals are no longer merely attempting to bypass our mechanical locks or silently avoid our digital sensors. They are now actively hacking directly into the fundamental cognitive processing of human attention. A highly expensive and technically advanced home security system is rendered completely useless if the human beings actively monitoring the digital feeds are successfully manipulated into staring exclusively at the exact location where the predator actively wants them to look. True residential safety, we must actively train ourselves to look far beyond the most obvious and incredibly loud digital distractions, while simultaneously possessing a direct familial link to immense public wealth and massive national influence, is automatically classified as an incredibly high-value proxy target. We must deeply understand that the actual fatal threat often operates in the absolute quietest and most thoroughly ignored physical spaces. The dark behavioral profile of the individuals who silently extracted Nancy Guthrie from her deeply isolated home remains profoundly incomplete. The physical investigation is completely stalled by the overwhelming psychological manipulation intentionally injected into the original crime scene. The back door has been permanently sealed, but the incredibly dangerous minds that orchestrated this flawless operation are still actively observing the world from the dark shadows. They completely shattered the deeply held illusion of absolute residential security by proving that a perfectly synchronized misdirection is infinitely more powerful than a heavy mechanical lock. As we continuously wait for the final microscopic evidence to be completely sequenced in the federal, we must profoundly respect the terrifying cognitive capability of the hidden phantom. In our very next detailed behavioral profile, we will systematically step inside the extreme contrast between her deeply private, quiet daily life and the massive public footprint of her daughter created a silent but incredibly dangerous underlying tension. Disturbed mind of an incredibly arrogant attacker who absolutely refused to use any physical decoys. Instead of hiding from the surveillance cameras, he intentionally left behind a massive psychological manifesto explicitly designed to completely challenge the entire American judicial system. We will meticulously decode that terrifying psychological document together. Please ensure you subscribe to Ellis Case Reports. Stay deeply curious, stay highly analytical, and maintain a strong situational awareness. To successfully maintain her sense of normalcy, Nancy relied heavily on a strict and unwavering personal schedule. She was a woman of profound faith and deeply ingrained lifelong habits. Every single Sunday morning, absolutely without any exception, she attended her local neighborhood church services. She left her large house at the exact same time, took the exact same driving route, and always sat in the exact same wooden pew. This kind of strict personal discipline is very often viewed as a psychological protective mechanism. We naturally want to believe that if we do the exact same safe things every single day, we will remain entirely safe from external harm. He is wearing heavy gloves, dark clothing, and a full facial mask. But a seasoned criminal psychologist views a rigid daily routine through a completely different and far more sinister analytical lens. To a highly calculated, routine-based human predator, a perfectly predictable schedule is absolutely not a protective shield. It is a highly detailed, extremely reliable operational blueprint. A suspected attacker does not need to guess where you will be or when you will be physically most vulnerable. You are unknowingly providing them with a perfectly synchronized operational timetable. The deeply isolated nature of her beautiful Catalina foothills home meant that someone could easily sit in the dark desert brush across the street, quietly observing her every movement day after day. They could meticulously document the exact time the exterior lights turned off each night. They could systematically note the precise moment she opened the heavy front door to retrieve her morning newspaper. They could slowly study the mechanical blind spots of her home security system without ever stepping foot on the actual paved driveway. But instead of quickly and efficiently disabling the electronic device with a heavy hammer, a sharp wire cutter, they were silently and patiently learning the deeply ingrained daily rhythms of her long life, completely undetected. The truly terrifying reality of complex targeted criminal operations is that the meticulous order you actively create to feel safe is exactly the structural weapon a predator uses to completely destroy you. The strict daily discipline that governed her quiet life did not successfully build an impenetrable fortress. Under the cold, calculating gaze of a patient and observing threat, your perfectly disciplined daily schedule is simply the rough operational draft for your own tragic and sudden disappearance from the safe world you carefully built around yourself. The devastating psychological trigger of this entire case did not begin with a loud, violent home invasion in the middle of the night. It began with a profoundly unsettling silence on a bright Sunday morning. On February 1st, 2026, the heavy wooden doors of the local Tucson church opened to welcome the usual congregation. The familiar faces filed into the sanctuary, taking their customary seats as the morning service officially commenced. Or a simple can of black spray paint. He spends precious, agonizing seconds fumbling with a handful of dead leaves. But the specific pew where Nancy Guthrie sat every single week remained completely empty. For a woman whose entire behavioral profile was heavily defined by strict punctuality and unwavering religious devotion, this sudden absence was not merely a casual oversight. It was a massive, blaring psychological alarm. Her close friends immediately recognized the severe behavioral anomaly. She was absolutely not the type of person to simply sleep in or skip a deeply important social commitment without thoroughly notifying her entire circle of friends well in advance. The very last time anyone had definitively seen or spoken to her was the previous day on January 31st. Law enforcement authorities were quickly contacted to perform a standard welfare check at her isolated residence. When the police cruiser slowly pulled into the long, winding driveway of the Catalina Foothills property, the responding officers were likely anticipating a very common, deeply unfortunate medical emergency. They expected to find an elderly woman who had perhaps suffered a sudden fall or a severe cardiac event while alone in her home. He meticulously and awkwardly presses the dry branches against the glass lens, slowly blinding the digital eye of the security system. They approached the large front entrance, verbally announced their official presence, and eventually gained access to the incredibly quiet interior of the massive house. What they discovered inside the residence immediately shifted the entire operational framework from a routine medical call to a high-priority criminal investigation. The house was entirely immaculate. There were absolutely no shattered glass panels on the floor. There were no deeply gouged marks on the wooden door frames indicating a desperate physical struggle. Not a single piece of delicate, decorative furniture had been knocked over or violently displaced. The primary living spaces, the long hallways, and the private bedrooms all remained in a state of absolute undisturbed perfection. The environment was completely sterile. To an untrained civilian observer, a perfectly clean and deeply quiet house might initially bring a brief wave of profound relief. It suggests that no violent or bloody physical confrontation took place. But when you analyze this specific scene through the highly trained lens of the behavioral analysis unit, that absolute perfect silence is actually the single most terrifying detail of the entire morning. To a casual observer, it looks exactly like an amateur mistake. A physical environment that lacks any structural chaos heavily dictates a very specific psychological narrative regarding the terrifying events of that early morning. It mathematically proves that an 84-year-old woman was not violently dragged out of her home against her active physical resistance. It strongly suggests that she was completely, utterly, and instantly physically subdued and psychologically controlled before she even had the split-second opportunity to react, to fight back, or to scream for any outside help. In the complex science of criminal psychology, executing a completely noiseless, frictionless, physical extraction of an awake or sleeping human target requires an incredibly high degree of strict operational planning and overwhelming physical dominance. It requires perpetrators who deeply understand exactly how to immediately neutralize the human instinct for desperate survival. The responding local officers stood in the middle of the pristine, deeply silent living room and slowly realized they were not looking at a chaotic crime scene. They were standing entirely inside a perfectly executed, highly sterile vacuum where a living, breathing human being had simply ceased to physically exist. The chilling question immediately shifted from simply wondering where she went to desperately asking who on earth possessed the specific psychological capability and the cold, it looks like the sudden desperation of an unprepared criminal making decisions on the fly, calculated discipline to make her vanish without leaving a single microscopic ripple behind in the physical environment. The absolute lack of physical evidence was not a lucky accident for the perpetrators. It was a clear, calculated message of their deeply terrifying competence. Faced with an incredibly clean and completely sterile physical environment inside the home, federal investigators immediately turned their intense focus toward the digital memory of the property. They legally extracted the video data from the exterior security network, desperately hoping the automated doorbell camera had successfully captured the terrifying moment the silent attackers breached the front door. What the high-definition video actually revealed is officially considered the most baffling and heavily scrutinized piece of physical evidence in the entire ongoing investigation. In the extremely early, dark hours of February 1st, the glowing infrared lens of the front camera captured a single, solitary male figure slowly approaching the main entryway. This unknown individual, currently referred to by analysts and media as the suspected porch guy, is completely obscured from head to toe